Hello and welcome to Full Disclosure, a podcast project conceived entirely to let me spend more time with interesting people than I would ever get on the radio. Caroline Lucas, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Green Party MP, soon to be ex-Green Party MP, a lifelong campaigner, lifelong eco-activist, long before it was cool, and author. All political careers end in failure, said someone once.
Well, I'm hoping my political career isn't over, so don't rush to judgment yet. There's all kinds of different ways of being political. And what I have said is that I'm not going to stand at the next general election. And that is more, frankly, a personal decision than it is any kind of reflection about the importance of being in Parliament. As you would imagine, I think it's crucial that there are Green voices in Parliament, probably now more than ever. But after 10 years in the European Parliament, 14 years in Westminster, working 70 or 80 hours a week, I just feel that I would love to just step back a bit, take a breath, and also not be the front bench spokesperson on absolutely everything, which is the position that I have now. You know, as the sole representative of my party, then I am drawn in so many different directions. And I would just love to find a way to really focus now on climate and nature, which are the things that get me out of bed in the morning. And obviously also work really hard to get someone else in Brighton Pavilion to represent the Green Party there. And also we've got some target seats in Bristol and Waveney Valley and in Herefordshire.
So the environment as both cause and consumer, you actually want to spend more time communing with nature, not just campaigning for it, I think.
I do. And actually, I almost feel that communing with nature, you could almost see in some senses as a prerequisite for recharging our own physical and mental batteries, if you like. There's a wealth of evidence about all of the mental and physical health benefits of being in nature, as well as just the sheer joy of walking out on the downs with your rescue dog and your husband in the morning. So,
and you extrapolate from that almost a form of national rehabilitation, the role that nature can play in a national rehabilitation in your new book, Another England, How to Reclaim Our National Story, which we will be talking about throughout this interview. But I'll begin with a question you must have been asked a million times. How come you are still the only voice, the only Green voice in Parliament, at a time when the consciousness of the broader movement has grown exponentially in the course of your tenure in Parliament? The numbers have stayed exactly static.
Well, I think that is sadly a reflection on our totally archaic and undemocratic electoral system. If you look at the general election after the one when I was elected in 2010, so if you look at the general election of 2015, over 1 million people voted Green, and yet still we end up with one MP. And that is not only bad for the Green Party, for a smaller party, but I would argue it's bad for all of those people that want to have a different kind of representation in Parliament. It's bad for people who think that every vote should count equally, and it clearly doesn't under our system. And I think if we needed any kind of evidence of just how warped that system is, I think those 1 million votes under a PR system could have delivered 20, 25 MPs, depending on the system that you chose. The visibility that we would have had then, and then as a result of that, the extra momentum that would have been behind the Green Party at that point could have been enormous. And in any other European country, pretty much it would have been.
And to people who point out that would also involve the latest iteration of somebody like Nigel Farage's sort of personality cult getting the same or more seats. How do you always respond to that warning? Or concern, at least?
It is a concern, but I simply don't think you should warp your electoral system and deny democracy because you don't like what it throws up. I think what you need to do is to address the root causes of why people like Nigel Farage are doing so well in the polls. What is it that people are really concerned about, and find other better ways of addressing that rather than allowing him to be a martyr on the outside, claiming that he's never been allowed into the system. We know that once you have the spotlight shown on some of the policies of some of the hard right, then it evaporates. The support for that evaporates.
Which brings us almost as if I planned it, which I didn't, because I wasn't planning to address it directly quite so early, to one of the central, in fact, I think one of the motivations behind your decision to write your new book, Another England, because it was the results of the Brexit vote that led you to sort of think, hang on a minute, there's something going on here that I do not understand enough, I think.
Yeah, no, that's right. I was really struck in the aftermath of that Brexit vote by the number of people on the Remain side, which was the side that I'd campaigned on, who were saying, I don't recognise my country anymore. And my response to that was, hang on a minute, if we don't, then we bloody well should. That's on us. What have we not been listening to? And also, when people said, I don't recognise my country anymore, by and large, they meant England. They didn't mean the UK as a whole. And so as a result of that, I embarked on a project which we called Dear Leavers, which was going out to lots of the Leave voting areas and genuinely listening to what are people's concerns. And two things came out of that, really. One was the real pride people have in the places that they're from. We spent quite a bit of time in Dudley, which is dear to my heart because my mum's from there. And there's a real, legitimate, understandable pride in its industrial heritage, but at the same time, an overwhelming sense of powerlessness because London feels like it's on another planet. People don't feel listened to. They don't feel they have agency. And so this got me thinking about the political structures that we have in the country, but also specifically about how in England we don't have those political institutions to give a voice to people in England. And it felt like, ironically, when you consider that the Brexit results in England, every region except London did vote to leave. So what was it about that? Why was England voting to leave? And ironically, I think in a way, it was sending a message to an establishment that they understandably felt was out of touch. But the way to do it, in a sense, the question they'd been asked by the establishment wasn't about England or not England. It was about Europe. And so given the opportunity to give the establishment a bloody great kicking, then why wouldn't they take it?
And these are impulses and convictions that are much more nuanced and much more sympathetic than simply there are too many foreigners here, and that was one of the distracting, because that's a very real constituency of people and a frequently heard complaint, but you're looking far beyond that.
I am looking far beyond that, because I think that is a misrepresentation if that was the only thing we took from that vote. So I think there were all kinds of things going on there in terms of the amount of power that's been drained out of local areas, the way in which so many areas have simply not been given the support that they need. And maybe the government's kind of finally woken up to that with the famous Levelling Up project. But that's just so utterly inadequate. It's still pitching places in competition with one another to try and fight for ever diminishing pots of money.
Yeah, I found that really helpful, because people voted because they felt they'd lost something that they could get back. And telling them that they hadn't lost something was completely the wrong response, because they clearly had. They were blaming its loss on the wrong sources, the wrong reasons. For me, I know Dudley well as well, but oddly, it was Margate for me that brought it home just before the vote. I was walking around Margate and I thought, well, if I lived here, I would have lived my entire life feeling robbed.
Yeah.
Because the signs of the grandeur, the epic grandeur of the pre-package holiday era were everywhere. The little plaques up in hotels talking about the belle monde and the gentry who would come and visit. And you could see the rusting ironwork on the seafront and the bandstands. You'd live your whole life thinking that I'm on the downward slope from the good days. Yeah. And all you needed to do was slide into that space and say, hey, Tap's nose, I'll tell you who took it all away from you. Yeah. I'll tell you where it went. And then that is one of the, I think, central
That's exactly it.
themes.
And those of us who voted to remain, or those of us who think of ourselves as broadly on the left, I think we've allowed those stories to be told about why you've lost that stuff, because we haven't given any better stories. And that sort of comes back as well to the book in a little way, in the sense that we tried, the Remain side tried to counter some very compelling, if fundamentally inaccurate, stories from the right with managerialism, with telling us that your shopping in your shopping basket is going to go up if you vote to leave, which was just a total misunderstanding of the emotional pitch that I think is so important when it comes to communicating pretty much anything.
Stories. The Remain side had no stories. It had no, whether they're myths or not. The power of the story is, it's everywhere, and that it's a very literary book, isn't it? It's as well as literate. It is. You draw on all sorts of examples. I was struck, apart from Orwell, I suppose, who pops up a little later in the text. I was struck by the way that devolved nations have literary heroes who address directly the soil, as it were, of their land, and the English don't have that. You've got Orwell takes almost a scientist's approach to it, but not a piper's approach to it.
Yes, exactly. And I was just fascinated by that, and just trying to unpack some of the reasons. And partly I think it is around the fact that England and Great Britain or the United Kingdom are forever being elided. No one's ever clear about which they're referring to, and so for England to own its own story in that way and have it reflected in music or in literature seems to be much harder. And to the extent that a lot of that literature from Wales or Scotland is basically about trying to free themselves from the shackles of England under the guise of this United Kingdom, we can't do that because we're it. So it feels like we've just lost our voice in some way.
Because there's nothing to push against.
Yeah.
So there's no focal point for who you are because you're not actually pushing against anything. I found that fascinating. It's got sort of colonial repercussions as well, hasn't it? If you are the occupying power, it's a lot harder to get an emotional flag around which you want everybody to gather because there's no, as I say, there's no point of push. There's nothing.
Exactly.
Who am I trying to free myself from? Who am I trying to liberate myself from? And that's why Robin Hood pops up. And you go back to the days when there was some sort of, whether it was the Normans or whether there was a sense of an English cause.
Yeah, I think it's just really interesting to see how myths and stories like Robin Hood have evolved over time and have been used with quite small political reasons. We might think of myths like Robin Hood of always being the same, that it was always the guy out there who's robbing the rich to give to the poor. But that's actually, relatively speaking, quite a late addition to the myth of Robin Hood. So it's just, I think, being a bit more savvy about the power of story and how the right seem to be a hell of a lot better than we are at choosing their stories and enabling them to evolve to achieve what they're trying to do.
We've jumped around and jumped ahead. Normally we begin at the beginning on full disclosure, but you mentioned Dudley, where your mum was from. She had migrated to Malvern.
She had.
By the time you came along, which is both geographically and socio-economically quite a journey.
I think that's true.
Malvern's very genteel. It's the epitome of gentility
it is.
Those of us who grew up in Worcestershire, I think.
Where did you grow up?
I was in Kidderminster, which is not the epitome of gentility by any stretch of the imagination. But I read that your dad sold solar panels, and then I thought, oh, I see. Yes, that's the origin story. And then I read that it was not a particularly political household.
Solar panels I hated because they were very early versions of them and they were on the side of the house just by my bedroom and they made a terrible racket in those days.
Must be the only solar panels in the country almost at that point.
Yeah, and to be fair, I don't think he was getting them because he was suddenly converted to the environmental cause. I think he was an entrepreneur and liked new things, and this was the latest new thing.
Because he had a central heating business as well. So solar panels.
So
you were the youngest by some distance of three siblings, which meant that you had probably, I think you've said, not unadjacent to being an only child in some ways.
Yeah, no, I think that's true.
So what was home like? Was your mum was a traditional mum, I think, as it were?
My mum stayed at home and kept an absolutely immaculate house without ever a flake of dust anywhere. And I vividly remember we had to sit on the sofa in a way such that you didn't sit on the same cushion all the time, otherwise it would wear it out. So she was very house proud, which is probably why I rebelled against that in quite a big way. So it was a happy childhood, but also one that it was happy without being joyful, and that sounds really ungrateful. Happiness ought to be enough, no? But it was a very unemotional childhood. My parents didn't like emotions. They didn't want to, of any kind. I mean, high joy or high despair. It was very, very much on a level. Not many books. So the thing that really changed my life as a child was meeting someone who became a very good friend from school, whose family and whose house, come to that, was diametrically opposed to mine. So the house was a tip, but it was so interesting, and so books everywhere. Her mum propping up Jane Austen on a stand as she was doing the baking in the kitchen and so forth. This was Rachel, yeah.
And this was when you'd gone to big school. This was when you went to Malvern Girls College.
Yeah, this was when I was about 13, 14.
Okay, well, let's back up a little bit then. What were you like at primary school? I did a bit about in a house with no books, or very few books. That's a surprise to me, reading.
I think I rebelled against that too.
What you have become. You certainly did. But so what were you like at primary school? Were you a good student?
Middling.
Right.
I think I wasn't not exceptional for sure.
And so we may as well start then at Malvern Girls College. Did you board there, even though you lived in Malvern?
No.
I thought
No.
that. So you went as a day girl.
I went as a day girl, and the reason that I went was that my sister had gone to the grammar school in Worcester and hated it. And so, I think she and my parents, having seen how much my sister hated that, they were looking for an alternative. And I'm very grateful in a sense, because it was a fantastic education experience there.
Were you dislocated as a day girl? Did you feel not fully in the swing of things?
There were enough of us as day girls, actually, that felt that we had the best of both worlds. It was pretty good.
It's a mad town, Malvern. It's got more school. It must have more private schools per square mile than anywhere else in the country. I don't think that's hyperbole.
Probably true.
It must be near, and some of them have shut since I was at prep school in Worcestershire. But I used to be going to Malvern every other Saturday to play rugby when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Why is that? Why? Because it's so nice. Probably land was cheap, was it? You could get a big old house and turn it into a school.
I imagine that's exactly right. And for people who are looking at, somewhere where the air was pure and clean and
of course,
whatever,
yes.
there it is. It was a nice place.
And were you, like me, would you be in the debating society railing against private education on principle while also benefiting from it? Or
not until afterwards.
Came a little later.
So that hypocrisy did come later, but it wasn't there at the time.
Until Rachel came along, then you were, by the sound of it, a sort of middling student who hadn't discovered any particular areas of passion.
I think that's true. But then I made up for it because because she was just an extraordinary influence on me. And some of the memories that you have, so at the top of the school there were music practice rooms, little tiny, because the building for the school had been a hotel, and right at the very top, I guess, there would have been the rooms where some of the people who worked in the hotel stayed. So these little tiny rooms, and we were supposed to be practicing the violin, but we had this system whereby we would open the windows and she would get her bow out the window and tap on my window, and then that was the sign. And then as long as nobody was looking, we would get together and read the poems of Emily Dickinson together, or, she would bring in something new that was, for me, just totally opening my eyes to a different world, which was just amazing.
And the teachers hadn't managed to do this previously?
No, I mean, we did have good teachers, but I guess this was just a few years ahead of where that would normally come.
Yes.
So it was that's what made it so kind of exciting, I suppose.
Yes, and a lifelong enthusiasm, a sort of lifelong passion was born.
Yeah.
You've also said that home wasn't political. I suppose that goes in a way with this reluctance to be demonstrative, because strong feelings and strong opinions are very similar to each other. And so you've described a sort of, we need to clarify that using the phrase Daily Mail to describe a political environment in the early 1970s is very different from what it means now.
You're right,
isn't it?
You're right. You are right. But it was a conservative voting household, but without being rabid.
Yes.
So yes, you're right the way you put it.
But unquestioning as well. I mean, you didn't have big chats over the dinner table about.
We had a few rows about things like the miners' strikes, I remember, and the Falklands War, but that was all a little bit later when I'd sort of gone away and then come back.
My dad was covering the miners' strike from Kidderminster at the time, but we didn't really row about it. So we're at Malvern. You've got this dawning, this kind of open, blossoming almost. Did that translate into academe? Did you then become a better pupil, a better student?
Yes, I think so.
As your O-levels approached, did you discover a kind of intellectual curiosity?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And so the arts in particular, I loved, and we had some fantastic teachers. I'm remembering a French teacher. I also did German and English for A-level, and what I loved about those was actually the literature that you got to read. So the poems of Heinrich Heine, or I remember we read Camus' L'Étranger, the outsider, with a fantastic French teacher. And it just, there's moments when you just feel that you're on the edge of a whole new world and a different way of looking at things. It was genuinely really exciting.
Because I know exactly what you mean, but how do we describe it to someone who doesn't? How do we articulate that thing?
I suppose it's just literally being suddenly aware of other ways of interpreting the purpose of life, I suppose, which sounds that's probably not very helpful, is it? But it was until then, I guess perhaps religion for some people does the same thing, and I didn't particularly have that. But it was just suddenly seeing your own existence within a much wider context in some sense and adding meaning to it in that way.
And it cuts back as well, doesn't it? So when you're trying to write a book like Another England, you have this canon upon which you can draw because someone else has already shown the way or made the point, or you can use this Elizabeth Gaitskell to make this point about this thing that you're seeking to convey.
Yeah.
And so that's the almost like the building blocks of intellectual consciousness in a way. And you're assembling them now at this point in your life.
I'm certainly trying to, so that sounds good.
So if I'd met you at 16 and said, what do you want to be when you grow up, what would you have said?
I think by the time I was 16, I would have wanted to be a writer. I think that's
Okay.
why I did English. I was, I had this vision in my head of Emily Dickinson, or a book from earlier on. I mean, I devoured Little Women, and who wouldn't want to be Jo March, and so those were my heroines at the time. Those were the people that I
And how would that be greeted at home? Would you tell mum and dad that you wanted to be a writer? I sort of sense
Yes,
it might not be an ambition they'd fully understand.
They didn't. And when I went on to study English at university, I do remember my father asking some very quizzical questions about what the point of that was, and why wouldn't you want to go and do international business or something. So we had a few discussions about that.
But it was a different era, wasn't it? So you would go to university without. Oh, no, you wouldn't. I always get my dates mixed up here. You wouldn't pay at all. Would you get your dad? You'd get a maintenance grant as well as so it was fully subsidised.
Paid. I mean, those were the days, eh?
It's almost impossible to convey that to my daughters.
And I bet she'd be bloody angry if you did.
Yes, I mean, it is breathtaking, isn't it? And it means, I saw one of your colleagues in Parliament this week railing against humanities and arts degrees because he'd seen a graph which plotted earning potential according to, and I just thought, good Lord, talk about the price of everything and the value of nothing, isn't it?
I mean, if you ever needed an example of why an arts education was important, whoever that person was has just made the case for it, because what a paucity of imagination not to be able to judge something except for the earning power that it's going to deliver.
Pecuniary value. So we haven't mentioned the environment yet. Well, at least in the context of your development. Did that kick in at Exeter University, or did it kick in earlier?
Not very much earlier, to be honest. No. I mean, the light bulb moment was the Jonathan Porritt book, the Seeing Green book that I read in about 86, I think. But before that, I mean, I've been growing concern and aware of some of the literature of the environment and how, understanding that it was being destroyed in a fairly terrifying way. I was also really involved with the campaign for nuclear disarmament, a little bit in the women's movement, and then this book was the glorious way of all of those things coming together. And I suddenly realized there were interconnections between these different parts of my life and these different parts of my concerns, that actually there was one, in this case, political party that had an approach that saw similarities and causal connections between an attitude to the environment that was top down and treating the environment as a sort of a mechanical body rather than as a living organism, was not so dissimilar to how some people treat other people, and in particular how men have treated women over the centuries and so forth. So I began to see some of these connections that I hadn't seen before. I
don't want to ask you the same question 30 times in the course of this conversation, Caroline, but again, when you explain it like that, it's quite self-evident what you discovered. I see why you have the sense of discovery of it and feeling that all of these threads can be assembled under the same.
You're just saying I was very slow at putting two and two together.
Quite the opposite.
Okay.
I'm imagining your frustration at the fact that this is still not more widely appreciated or understood.
Yes, there, you are absolutely right. And, some of the incredibly complicated ways now governments come up with ways that developers are supposed to take into account the net gain of destroying one bit of ancient woodland over here, and imagining that if you just invested in a few trees somewhere else, that there was an equivalence between that, because a tree is a tree, isn't it? No. One has taken hundreds of years to get that kind of ecosystem, and the other one, it's not.
Interconnectedness.
Yes.
Isn't it?
Absolutely.
And it's, I don't know, was the easiest and the hardest thing to see sometimes. It is bizarre. You went to Greenham Common. You weren't just sort of campaigning at Exeter. You were.
I never stayed there, but I certainly went and visited. Yeah.
What was it like?
Oh God, it was just. I mean, I'm just going to sound totally naive again, aren't I? But
No.
there was something so moving about the solidarity and, I will use the word love because it felt like that on the outside, of people coming together from all kinds of different backgrounds and representing life and tying their ribbons or whatever else onto these very grey, formidable, barbed wire fences which were keeping us out and away from the nuclear missiles which had the potential to destroy the world many times over. So there was a real symbolism there, I think, between life and death, as well as, you know, the importance of simply being there and showing solidarity and trying to get a focus on the true implications of being wedded to nuclear weapons.
Even now, to point out the connection between trying to keep cruise missiles off British soil and the then lifelong commitment to trying to protect British soil. Sometimes you need a bit of help, don't you?
Yeah,
to see the interconnectedness. So that was the first big cause then, was CND. And did it change you? Did you dial down your academic commitments? Did you become one of those students that was more campaigning than studying, spending more time on a protest than in the library?
I think it probably slowed down my academic work, but it felt really meaningful and more meaningful as time went on. And so, jumping ahead slightly, but by the time I was reading Seeing Green, I was actually doing a PhD in English, and I had thought for a while that maybe a future might have been in academia. I think I'd probably reconciled myself to the fact that I wasn't going to be the next Louisa May Alcott or Jane Austen or whatever else. But still, the opportunity to study and to write could be fulfilled through some kind of academic career. But then I think the reality of the environmental crisis and the nuclear crisis. So this was the time, sort of, those films that were coming out in the early 80s about nuclear destruction and so forth. It was a very live debate then that is quite hard to perhaps communicate to young people in particular now, because it's, no one ever talks about nuclear weapons now, almost. No. Keir Starmer mentioned it recently to kind of just assure everybody that he wants to destroy the world many times over too. But essentially, it's not part of our discourse. I remember actually the very first amendment I ever put down in Parliament when I was elected shortly after 2010. The government was having a debate on its strategic defence review, and so sacrosanct are nuclear weapons that the nuclear weapons weren't in the Strategic Defence Review. They were just like off limits because, of course, that's a given. We're keeping those and then let's look at the rest of it. And so I had an amendment down trying to get the Strategic Defence Review to possibly take into account the fact that we are spending so much on nuclear weapons.
You're right, actually. That it was traumatising for previous generations. There'd be young people who would process stuff they'd heard, sometimes the 4-minute warning and the conversations about. People grew up frightened.
They did,
and then it just suddenly dissipated, didn't it? It's bizarre that
it is, given that the threat hasn't gone away, and
exactly.
If anything, is more.
Maybe we reached a sort of collective conclusion. Oh, no one's ever going to use them anyway, which makes having them doubly ridiculous.
Well, indeed, yes, exactly.
So that's the nature of deterrent, isn't it? That's the mutually assured destruction argument.
Yeah.
I'd never clocked that before. Back up a little bit, because before you did the PhD, you got a scholarship to study journalism at the University of Kansas, or not? That's
slightly muddled. I did go to the University of Kansas. There were 2 scholarships from my university to the United States. One was to Berkeley, California, and the other one was to Lawrence, Kansas. And I got the one to Lawrence, Kansas, which was an experience. But what I thought I was doing there actually was a master's. So the journalism was something I did online separately and afterwards.
So it was a master's in English literature?
Well, so I thought it was, but in fact, it just showed I didn't ask enough questions. So I assumed that a master's would be a year long, and the money they gave me was for a year. So that's what I assumed. And anyhow, it turned out the master's was a 2-year course, of which they'd only given me money for 1 year. But in fact, that turned out to be quite a good thing, because I decided that I wouldn't actually study for the master's. I would just take a whole range of different courses.
Oh, nice.
Follow your instincts and what you wanted to do. So I did a lovely course in modern art history, in folklore, in Buddhist philosophy. I mean, it was just wonderful. I sort of curated my own little kind of set of things I wanted to dip into, which was, as it happened, lovely. But what was funny about being in Lawrence, Kansas, I was just going to briefly say, I don't know if you remember the nuclear film, I think it was called The Day After, but it was it was based on the premise that Lawrence, Kansas had been destroyed overnight. So it was so weird.
Oh, was that town?
Being out there
Wow.
in that town. So the next morning after you've just watched the film, you're almost kind of pulling the curtains back with some trepidation, thinking that was just a film, wasn't it? Like, is the town hall still standing?
So you came back with no qualification. You didn't get a particular qualification, but your horizons were broadened and your depth of understanding was greater. And then you did a PhD.
Exactly.
In English literature.
Yeah.
Which is when you read Jonathan Porritt's book, Seeing Green,
exactly.
and felt, genuinely, did you feel this ground shift beneath your feet?
I really did. I remember exactly where I was when I finished reading it. I remember I was in a rather miserable bedsit in Clapham. I turned the book over and I saw that it said that the Green Party office was in the Clapham High Road, which obviously felt like serendipity. So I marched up and down the road, confidently expecting to find a large building with a plaque on the wall saying Green Party, and eventually found a sort of shoe cupboard, as it was, behind a Chinese restaurant, I think. But yeah, so I signed up there and then, literally the same day that I'd finished reading the book.
And felt your future change as well.
Yeah,
not
no,
just
it felt like
present.
this is what I've been looking for. I'm coming home.
I have to do this. What did it feed then? What did it meet in you? I need to be something. I need to believe in something, or a way to address the things you already believed in.
No, the latter.
Right.
I think it was more.
Got it.
He was a way that I could address those things without feeling that on one night I was out at a CND meeting, the next night I was out at a environment meeting, the next night I was doing something for the women's group or something. It was like, actually all of these are interconnected and I can just do one meeting and focus on the Green Party.
Talk us through the book briefly, if you would, Caroline, for people who haven't read it. It's a manifesto, really, isn't it? In a sense.
So Jonathan Porritt at the time, he since then he's been a director of Friends of the Earth, and he's set up something called Forum for the Future. So he's been an environment campaigner for a very long time. But he was one of the first members of what was originally the Ecology Party and stood for the Ecology Party. And this was, I think, just about the first really rigorous manifesto that went through Green Party policy sort of issue by issue, so education and health as well as environment and climate, and showed how they were connected. And again, maybe looking back now, it does seem totally obvious. But at the time, when I read it, it was news to me that actually when we say we have a national health service, in fact, we have a national sickness service, because what we're measuring is how many people go through that system. And we get very excited as the number goes up because we think that means that the system's being more efficient, rather than it means, hang on a minute, why are so many people sick in the first place? Why are so many people sick in the first place? Lots of those issues are around air pollution or chemicals or, the environmental impacts on people's health. So it was just seeing how all of these things were interconnected and that there was a set of policies that could address them in a kind of coherent and consistent way.
And you, it became your job quite quickly. I think you joined in 86 and you became the National Press Officer in 87.
Yes, I think that was because they were offering such a pitifully low salary. And I think there were just two of us who went for the job. And somehow I managed to persuade them that having a PhD in 16th century English literature was exactly what they needed to get the Green Party right up in the lights.
So did you learn the job while doing it, did you?
I did, but it was an amazing experience and opportunity, because at that time, so this is now between 87 and 89, the environment was actually in the news a lot, not least because Mrs. Thatcher, for all of her many other faults, did recognise the importance of climate change.
She was a scientist, wasn't she?
She was a scientist, and she made some actually incredibly powerful speeches at the time. At the same time, there were environmental problems that suddenly became visible. So there were fishes and so forth dying in the seas, and there were photographs on the front pages of the newspapers about that. And the story I like to tell was in 87, I think that we got about 1.3% in the general election of 87. And then in 89, it was the European elections where we got 15% of the result. Now, that was not all down to me and my press work, but it was a fascinating time to be sort of on the front line of green politics. And all kinds of people who, in their day jobs were working for the BBC or some other broadcasting or journalism, actually did come and help. So the support that I got in that job at that time was phenomenal, because lots of people volunteered because they felt that this was, the moment of breakthrough. Sadly, as we now know, it wasn't. But
you've preempted my question. And again, this is the question I'm conscious of not wanting to ask you variations of 17 times. But that you did believe that if this is just one last push almost, and we're going to get we're going to get the boulder to the top. We're near the top of the hill, and once we
Yeah.
get to the top of it, that's it. The boulder's off forever. The cause will be so clear that
I did
the
think that
urgency, the necessity will be absolutely irrefutable, and it'll just be a question of managing.
Exactly. I did think that then.
When did you realise it hadn't? When was the moment of, gosh, it hasn't happened?
Pretty soon afterwards,
It was.
to be honest. Pretty soon afterwards.
Is that why you went to work for Oxfam? Or?
No, I went to work for Oxfam because if you were an employee of the Green Party, quite understandably, you couldn't then stand for, on their executive or whatever. So in a sense, working for Oxfam was a way of continuing my press work, but also enabling me then to stand for more political roles within the Green Party.
How did you process that failure then? How did you that shock? Actually, is probably a better word than failure. That actually, what is so obvious to you and to many and to all of your colleagues at the Green Party got that initial momentum, 15% in the Euro elections. Any minute now, the whole world's going to wake up, and then they're still asleep.
Well, I suppose we totally underestimated the vested interests of the big companies and the fossil fuel industry in particular, who would push back and who would say, all of these estimates about how serious climate change are just simply not true. And then we would also have a government by then who would say, well, we've got it sorted. Don't worry. You don't need to do anything. You'd have people who would be misrepresenting what the Green Party was standing for and telling everybody that, if they voted Green, then they'd be shivering in a cave around a candle. So we just, I underestimated the power of vested interests fighting back.
How dirty were they?
Well, I mean, we know that they were extremely dirty. I can't say that necessarily about the Green Party specifically, but about the Green cause, we absolutely know that they knew perfectly well the damage that fossil fuels were doing for decades and decades, and hid it and paid other think tanks and so forth to pump out misinformation, and so it continues.
It
sadly.
does indeed. How do you rationalise that personally? I mean, because again, you'd think that if you've got the document in front of you that speaks of an existential threat to our species, then there's no money in the world that would make me go and appear on the telly to talk about why you're all wrong. But how do you rationalise the behaviour of your enemies? Opponents.
I genuinely find that incredibly difficult.
So do I.
Because they've got kids presumably, and they care about their futures, and whether they genuinely believe that somehow there is going to be some technological fix that's going to sort of all of this out, and so they can just carry on with business as usual. I don't know. I do find it very hard to know how they sleep at night, I must say. I mean, if you knew that you were deliberately pumping out disinformation in order to hold back much needed action on securing a safer world, how do you live with yourself doing that? I genuinely don't know.
The best parallel is probably tobacco, isn't it? In terms of the efforts put in by the vested interests to keep what they knew to be the truth from the people who were providing them with the profits. But the stakes are that much more personal rather than planetary, aren't they? Stakes are much lower. So this is a crucial period then. The 10 years at Oxfam, during which you were seeking election as a Green Party politician. What were your sort of big breakthroughs? When did you feel?
Well, I became the first ever county councillor in Oxfordshire. So back in '93, I've been standing for local elections and became the first Green on the county council. And of course, the big change came with the change to the voting system. So in 1999, so 10 years after our 15% of the result, but no seats. I didn't actually add that bit. So we got our lovely 15%, but because it was under first past the post, it didn't deliver any seats. By the time we got to 1999, 10 years later, the European institutions had insisted that every election to those institutions should be under a fair voting system. So the UK was dragged kicking and screaming into changing the electoral system just for the European elections. And as a result, in '99, I was elected for the South East region, and my colleague Jean Lambert was elected in London. So that was a big moment.
What was it like in the European Parliament? I mean,
I loved it.
A big culture change for you as well.
It was a big culture change, but it just being with a group of 30 or 40 other Greens who were not only in parliaments but in governments across Europe was just so exciting. It was a wonderful opportunity to really see that actually Greens can be simply part of the of the political furniture, not these kind of outliers that very occasionally pop up on a council or in an elected place. But they were in parliaments, in governments, building on experience. There was a wonderful time when I think about 5 of the environment people, the tops of the environment in the European institutions were all environment ministers. That's
Yes.
what I'm trying to say. So in the Environment Council, were all from the Green Party, which was pretty special.
Yes, and yet also presumably the grimness of the contradiction or the contrast with the domestic political. So you'd look at the other countries and the prominence they gave to Green politicians, and B, you'd look at what could be achieved in Brussels and compare it to Westminster. So it's a sort of double-edged sword, really.
It was a double-edged sword, and I'm afraid I do also blame the media a bit for that, because it is true that there was so little coverage of anything that happened in the European institutions, even though, if you take environment policy, about 80% of environmental policy in the UK was being decided in the European Union, including by British MEPs. But somehow that was just never properly covered, so that by the time we running on again got to the Brexit referendum, unsurprisingly, no one had any idea what the European institutions were actually doing, and so that left a lovely void for Nigel Farage and his cronies to fill with disinformation.
Well, I'm glad you've made that jump, because with all your hats on, your press officer hat, your journalism diploma hat, your activist hat, your politician's hat, you should be in a position to answer the question better than most, if not better than anyone, as to why the UK media in particular was so delinquent on this front. Is it as simple as them having fingers in the same pies as the vested interests that we talked about earlier?
There is probably some of that, but I think it was also just a lack of patience, a lack of recognizing that. I mean, it is true that European legislation is very long and complicated, and it just felt like, I don't know, it just felt like even good journalists didn't really want to be bothered with all of the ins and outs of, what part of the process are we in now, and is it with the Commission, is it with the Council, who's doing what, which was pretty much an abnegation of responsibility. I think they had a responsibility to work that out, and a piece of legislation that I was involved in. What was wonderful about the European Parliament in many ways was that you got the opportunity to pilot through a piece of legislation from start to finish without necessarily needing to be the government, because there wasn't a government. So the different committees chose people to be the so-called rapporteur, the person to pilot through a piece of legislation. So I was working on legislation around trying to ban the import of illegally logged timber, and it was massively important, and trying to get any engagement with UK journalists was so difficult, even though it would have implications for the wood supply chain in Britain just as much as any other European country.
And it's not a bad story either,
it's
is it?
It's not a bad story. It's got a good story about how this is useful. This is something that needs to be done on a European basis, given that we're importing through lots of different countries.
When did you see the writing on the wall for Brexit then? Were you an early canary, do you think, because you understood the potential dangers of this vacuum that had been created and this abnegation of duty that the media had undertaken, and as you really touch on as you focus on in the new book, the siren call of misinformation, of populist misinformation?
I would love to be able to tell you that I had
1972
seen all of that, but I didn't. And worse, I don't know if you're going to ask me what's my biggest regret, but I shall tell you in any case, because I voted for there to be a referendum on the EU, because I genuinely, and as we know now, naively, stupidly, thought that it could be possible to have a genuine debate about the importance of the European institutions, but also, let's accept that they are far from perfect. They need reform. But all kinds of institutions need reform. It doesn't mean to say you kind of take your bat away and walk off. The British Parliament's not great, but we don't just disband the whole thing. But I had sympathy with people who said that they felt that the European institutions had been done to them, that they felt that they'd never had a a say in the way in which the EU was developing. I think there was truth in that. So when there was the opportunity to have that referendum, I really thought it would be an opportunity to have a serious debate and discussion about the work that the EU did, how we might want to change it in the future, and so on. And of course, that proved to be
Well, it could
impossible.
have been. It could have been quite easily, but possibly not in the media ecosystem that we all inhabit. That was probably a hiding to nothing from the start. I would talk briefly about Parliament, because that, of course, is the period of your life for which you are best known. Becoming the first Green Party MP for Brighton Pavilion back in 2010. Why did you want to move from Brussels to Westminster?
Because it felt like you could have had 50 Green MEPs, but actually it made sod all difference to the political discussion and debate in this country. So it completely links to the conversation we've just been having, that we had no real influence on the politics. We ironically had quite a lot of influence on policy. So there was my policy on banning illegally logged timber. That went very well. That got through the institutions. But getting credit for policy wasn't changing the political debate. And it felt like if you're going to try to get a green voice that's being heard loud and clear in the UK, you need to be in the Westminster Parliament.
And touching again on that relationship between political establishment and media, the frequency with which Farage and essentially him, but even Nick Griffin once, the shop window that a programme like Question Time provides, in a fair universe, wouldn't Green Party representatives have been on that a lot more over the years?
I don't know if it's fair to lay that responsibility to Question Time, because I do think they've been pretty fair to me, actually.
Okay,
I've been on
fair enough.
But in general, if you were talking in general sort of big political programmes and so forth, you're absolutely right that we've always fought so hard to be taken seriously on those programmes and to be given a voice on those programmes. And I remember as the press officer back in 1987, I was always told, you're not in Parliament, so we can't include you.
No, you are.
Then we are in Parliament, and they still come up with reasons for not including us.
And reform still isn't. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, doesn't it? In the terms of opinion polling, we'll have this character on this programme and a spokesperson from here, but you were in Parliament and you're still... Why is that then? You must have given that a lot of thought over the years. What is that? I mean, maybe you don't sell as many tickets. It's easier to sell tickets for the ghost train than it is for the speak your weight machine, isn't it? And so you're in the speak your weight machine business, not the ghost train business.
I knew I was doing something wrong.
It's less box office.
Yeah. I mean, it is hard to know why, because I genuinely think, and this is the point that I've always made when I've been trying to persuade programmes, that by having a green voice, actually it's good. It's good for the audience. I mean, it's a different point of view. Increasingly, when you've got Labour and Tory, who in many ways are less distinguishable than they should be.
Yes.
That the need to have a fresh and different voice, I think, is good for the audiences and good for public interest, just as much as it's good and right to represent, all the different voices that are in Parliament.
And so, speaking of fresh and different voices, we'll come back to Another England, how to reclaim our national story. And I love that word, reclaim. I don't want to oversimplify things, but you write a bit about flags and the Union flag in particular. This notion of Englishness, English nationalism having been quite an ugly, easily stereotyped thing over the course of most of my life. The recognition that in order to reclaim our national story, you have to reclaim some of the paraphernalia that has been co-opted by the far right, I think.
You do, but in a thoughtful way, not in a way...
give it back.
And not just in a way that's about wrapping yourself in the flag as well, which is frankly what we do see quite a lot of at the moment. But I suppose the bigger point is just that it feels like if the only people who feel confident about speaking about England and the English are the hard right, at least. They are the ones who, have the stories of English exceptionalism and imperial nostalgia and all of that. Then if we cede that ground, by we, I suppose, I mean on the broad centre and left, if we cede that ground to the right, then the rise of more populist politics becomes even more likely and accelerates, because no one else is telling any other stories about what and who the English are and have been.
So that's why I like that's why I focus on the word reclaim, because it's all there.
Yes.
It's just not getting the air. I mean, in many ways, that defines your mission, doesn't it? I mean, the green, it's all there. The evidence is all there.
Yes.
It's all, you just can't get it in front of enough bloody faces, enough
Exactly.
eyes to make the point. I tell you what I thought of while reading some of it was the Museum of the Working People in Manchester, where the stuff that never came up in history classes. My school was weird. It's a bit like your school. I studied Charlemagne for my history A-level. I'd never heard of the Peterloo Massacre.
Yeah.
But English history, not British history, English history, Kett's Rebellion, the Levellers, much of which you talk about in the book, it's not known. It's as if that has been probably deliberately squeezed out by the people who would have been damaged by it or set to lose it.
Exactly. It felt like there was a real responsibility to uncover some of this stuff and join it up. I mean, people obviously do know about the Levellers or the Diggers or the Tolpal martyrs, but actually putting that together as a more of a coherent story and coming across, which I didn't know until relatively recently, about the Charter of the Forests. So most
I didn't repealed it in 1971.
I know.
So it came in what, 1279?
1217.
1217. Forgive me, Caroline. Rats. Back in the class. And so it was brought in 1217.
And was read out in churches 4 times a year and had to be for centuries. We sometimes learn about the Magna Carta, which is about our political rights. The Charter of the Forests came out 2 years later and was an amazing document that basically encapsulated people's rights to the natural environment and to its resources and made sure that landless people still could have access to land. It was an incredibly radical document.
Yeah.
And yet most of us have never heard of it.
The Tories took it away in 1971, by which time it was more or less redundant anyway.
It was, to be fair,
because of enclosures, probably, more than anything else.
Yes, I mean,
which is a story you also tell.
Yeah.
And that's why I want to really do justice to the interconnectedness of what you've written, because, you know, having access, when I visit the New Forest, I'm always struck by the notion of common land, and that shouldn't be anomalous. And then I go to Norfolk and everything's owned by the same small number of people. There's 2 Englands there. And the England you're writing about is the New Forest England, or rather the England you want to reclaim is the New Forest England, as opposed to the Norfolk England, where you can tell that village is owned by the same aristocrat because all the front doors are the same colour.
Exactly. And I'm really excited about the renewed momentum actually now behind the Right to Roam campaign. There's a real sense now that people want to really rebel against the fact that in England we only have a legal right to roam on access land for 8% of the land of England, and for rivers it's even less. And so there is this kind of renewed focus on that. And we know all of the good reasons people need access to the land. But I just find it a marvellous irony in the fact that what gave a real boost to the campaign recently was the case of Alexander Darwall. I don't know if you remember, he was the guy in Dartmoor, who owns thousands of acres of Dartmoor, and took it into his head that he really didn't like the fact that Dartmoor was the last place where people could wild camp without seeking prior permission. So he took a court case out to try and stop people doing that. And people who'd never dreamt of going to wild camp in Dartmoor, didn't even know they had a right to, suddenly were woken up.
Hang on a minute.
I might well want to go and do that, please. And so suddenly you had thousands of people descending on Dartmoor to reclaim their right to do it.
Who's the book aimed at? Who's your dream reader? Who's your Jonathan Porritt reader? The person you want to read this and feel the ground shift beneath them, as yours did when you read Sea and Green. Don't be modest.
I hope it will appeal to people who wouldn't read a narrowly political text, and that's one of the reasons for putting the literature in there. So I hope that I will reach people who have perhaps some vague feeling that that something is missing in terms of our analysis of our political analysis of who owns what and why things are going the way they are, and are feeling kind of dismayed by what's happened to the Conservative Party, which is becoming not really a Conservative Party, but a hard right populist party, and are just looking for some kinds of alternatives, because there are, I think, some pretty radical policy proposals in there, although they're not radical, they're just common sense. But today they seem radical because the shift to the right has gone so far. You know, the centre of gravity has moved so far to the right that, you know, suddenly talking about a wealth tax is radical. I mean, for goodness sake.
Or a universal basic income.
Or a universal basic income. So I hope it will reach people who would never have picked up a book that was all about a universal basic income or land value tax or wealth tax. But through seeing the kind of way in which the argument unfolds and and seeing the links with the literature and so forth might, they might suddenly find themselves hopefully agreeing with some of that stuff that they would not have agreed with if they just read it in a party manifesto.
Is it more about reminding people what they already have, as opposed to encouraging them to bemoan what they've lost? It is actually still yours, and it is actually still there.
That's a really nice way of putting it.
I hope so.
Yeah, no, I hope that's the case.
Which is
it is
antidote to populism, isn't it, in a way, if
Absolutely.
you think of it in terms.
Exactly. No, I think it's a really potent way of framing what I'm trying to do.
And therefore needs to be English and England, because that's where the populism has thrived.
Exactly.
How do you stay optimistic, Caroline Lucas?
I stay optimistic because there are just so many bloody good people in the world, aren't there? And I find huge comfort in meeting and coming across so many fantastic people doing great things, whether it's a small community group, who are reclaiming a bit of river, or whether it's some new speaker at a climate summit that I'd never heard before, who suddenly crystallizes things with great, strength and humor. There are great people out there doing great things. We have all of the technologies, all of the solutions, all of the finance that we need to get ourselves onto a greener, fairer way forward are all here. I mean, going to your point, stuff's here. It's it's not that we don't have the money. It's not that we don't have the technology. It's like who controls it and who's got it. And that means everything's to play for.
And that's why it's so beautiful that you knit together the political and the personal, because it's true for the person as well. You do have access to nature. You may not understand how much your life will be improved by communing with nature, but it is there. We've just got to find ways of bringing the mountain to Mohammed almost. Haven't we?
Yeah. And that's one of the things in terms of what I have managed to do in Parliament. One of the things I am most proud of is having secured government support for a new GCSE in natural history.
Ah, yes, of course.
Because it worries me that lots of young people do grow up not having that knowledge of, love for, intimacy with the natural world. And this new GCSE is designed to be something really empirical, something where you get the soil under your fingernails. And it's not so much about the systems of the natural world, which is where you'd find that in biology, but it is about the individual fauna and flora. It is about being able to name your flowers and your insects. And that well, speaking for myself, the level of joy I get when I do recognise a particular bird or a particular plant, and I'm rubbish at it, but when I do, you suddenly feel, hang on, I'm part of this, and it's part of me, and it feels transformative.
Yes, and Chris Packham was sitting in that chair not long ago, and you speak of what he's dedicated his entire life to, is just trying to help people make that connection, because it will help them. It's altruistic work. It's not prescriptive or preachy.
Yeah.
It's born of a belief that if you can do this, if I can help you access this, your life will be improved.
Yeah, be 100-fold richer.
It was the big sky for me during lockdown. I hadn't even realised how much I missed it. And just to be out somewhere where the sky is as far as, without any build, just that. Actually, the first time I got back to the beach after lockdown, I felt something really profoundly emotional inside me, and I couldn't quite believe it. It was existential. It was so deep. It was magical.
Yeah.
What are you most looking forward to when you're no longer an MP? If that's not a silly question.
Time.
Is it?
Time. And not having to put the radio on the first thing I do when I wake up and the last thing I do before I go to bed, because I have this sense that because I'm the only one there in Parliament, that everything's on me. And that's not really true, because there are plenty of other Greens who are, they've got 2 members of the House of Lords and we've got members of the London Assembly. But I internalise the fact that it needs to be me. And so that sense of always needing to know what's going on in case, the Greens need to make a response to something.
Of course. You've got to be across everything.
Yeah. And
Is it lonely? I know you mention your colleagues, and you're right that there's representation now on a much higher scale than when you went into politics, although not in Westminster. Has it been a lonely experience at times?
Yeah, I think it has, if I can say that without sounding too pathetic, because I do have friends and allies in other parties, and I do work closely with Plaid or with people like Clive Lewis in Labour and so forth. So it's not like I'm sat there and no one's talking to me or something, but at a deeper level, in terms of having an ally who's really on the same page as you, and when some minister has been even more gratuitously offensive and insulting and patronising than usual. That having that other person, even just one other person to say, God, that was awful, wasn't it?
Because you had that in Brussels.
That.
You had that in Brussels.
I had it. It was beautiful. 30 or 40 people. It was wonderful.
But not here.
Here.
We're almost done. Just sort of knitting together a few of the things that we've talked about. There was a line, I think you wrote, did you write the line that the Conservatives don't believe in equality, or you something similar to that? Is there do you worry that there's almost a feudalistic feel to the direction of traffic? I look at the concentration of wealth and the way in which lockdown in particular saw the richest people in the world get richer and richer and richer while everybody else is moving in the opposite direction. The distribution of not just material goods, but also access to some of the things that you've written about in the book. You draw on Dickens a lot. Dickens is probably the closest you get, or the closest we get, to an English Walter Scott, isn't he? Or an English, a holder of the English
Yes, although I'm
story.
quite critical of him too, in the way that...
No, you are.
He does a fantastic job of shining a spotlight on inequality and the terrible conditions that so many people were living in London, for example, at the time. But I worry about his solutions, because his solutions tend to be suddenly you find out that Oliver Twist was in fact
guess what, we're on the winning side.
He was an aristocrat all along.
So don't worry about inequality, because it doesn't affect you anymore. But
exactly.
I mentioned him because of the relative comfort with which people lived with epic inequality. I couldn't believe this, and I only discovered it relatively recently. That verse in All Creatures Great and Small, where it says, the rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate.
I mean, can you imagine?
Well, because I think we might be heading... that's my question, my final question. Second last question is, do you think that perhaps the kind of people who quite like that idea are in the box seat at the moment? They're on the rise at the moment.
I do, and I think it's incredibly dangerous. Yes. But I think there is that sense that if you're at the gate of the castle, then that's your fault, because you haven't...
Yes, exactly.
You haven't worked hard enough. You haven't...
You can feed yourself for 30p.
You only
got yourself to blame.
Exactly. You can't cook. You've never learnt to cook,
Personal responsibility.
And that is all around us at the moment from this government. And... I worry what happens, if Labour doesn't come up with a strong enough offer when they get in, because I think it's fairly sure they will get in, then what kind of Tory government do we get after that? My God, when you've got Liz Truss threatening to come back, and that is their worldview is absolutely that. And
they think their recent failures are born of not having been vicious enough.
Exactly.
So I share your fears.
Yeah.
In conclusion, what, in terms of sort of formal box-ticking type ambitions, what do you have left?
Learning to play the accordion, does that count?
Perfectly counts,
marvellous.
Yeah.
Yep.
But I might want a bit more.
I do want to do something with nature and climate, and I don't know what it will look like yet. But I am really interested in the arts and their contribution to bringing about change. And one of the things I've enjoyed most as my time as an MP, I was asked if I would curate an exhibition at the Towner Art Gallery. So they basically said, you have total access to all of our collections, put together an exhibition, which was just like being a kid in a sweet shop. So I did put together an exhibition, and it was about climate change, but it was climate change through looking at the eroding coastline around Sussex and the chalk coastline being eroded by that erosion being accelerated by climate change and so on. And I really loved that. I loved the way that you could use a different set of ways of communicating with people who would never, as I say, pick up a party manifesto, but might just come to it through the arts. So I'm interested in looking at the role of the arts in bringing about social change, I guess.
Another England, How to Reclaim Our National Story, is out now. Caroline Lucas, thank you.
Thank you so much.